Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Melanie Walker. I'm the CEO of the Australian Alcohol and Other Drugs Council, and thank you for joining our online event this afternoon, or actually this morning, depending where you are in Australia. I know we've got people joining us from all over. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm coming to you from here today, here in the ACT, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge their continuing contribution to the life of this city and this region. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that everyone who's joining us today is coming from, because as I said, I know we've got people from all over the country joining us today, so welcome. I'd like to also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us from all around Australia today. So thank you for joining us for our first online event of 2025. My God, I can't believe it's March already, hey? So what we're talking about today is best practices for AOD services in media engagement and lived and living experience storytelling. So AADC has developed a couple of resources that we're going to showcase for you today. And as the flyer for the event indicated, lived and living experience of alcohol and other drug use are frequently featured in media reporting. And while these accounts can challenge stereotypes, media coverage often stigmatises AOD issues, leading to some very negative outcomes for those involved. And this event is going to showcase a new resource, two actually, developed by AADC over the last year and a half or so, to support best practices in AOD services when approached by the media for access to lived and living experience stories. So the genesis of this event and these resources were some conversations that we had, nearly 2 years ago now, with people including Chris Goff, who's the current president of the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League, and Jill Rundle, who was currently the AADC board chair at the time and is with us here today to speak on the panel. Lovely to have you on this journey with us, Jill. And we were talking about things that were hot topics in the sector and things of concern for the sector. And that was where this conversation started. And we were talking about a number of media stories that had been prominent back then that had been very well intentioned, but possibly had the potential to have some very negative outcomes for the people involved. And we talked about the experiences that we'd had over the last 20 years or so of engagement with media and how we could potentially develop some sort of resource to help services to navigate those challenges. We then took the idea to our membership through a workshop at the annual general meeting back in 2023. And fast forward, here we are today. But in between, there was a lot of hard work done by a reference group who has worked to develop this resource under the leadership and coordination of James Dunne, who is the Policy and Projects Coordinator here at AADC. And James is going to take you through these new resources today. Then we're going to have a chat with James and a panel of experts discussing alcohol and other drugs, stigma, media portrayals, and all of this in the context of an upcoming federal election, and how the risk to those sharing their lived and living experience stories can be minimised when participating in sector advocacy. Now, I know this is a hot issue for all of us when we're on, I guess, the eve of having an election called, and many services will be thinking about how they can engage with media to promote their key priorities in the context of an election campaign. We know that in Australia, we have around 500,000 people being turned away from drug and alcohol services every year. And we do need to engage in these public discussions through media and through engagement with politicians. And everyone is wanting to elevate the voice of lived experience in having these conversations and developing policy and programs that respond to these needs. So how we do that in a respectful, effective way that doesn't do any damage to the individuals involved is the topic of today's conversation. So we have with us, joining James on the panel, Jenny Valentish. Jenny's a journalist and media trainer, and also the author of a book called Woman of Substances, that talks about her lived experience in this space. Michael White is the Executive Officer of the South Australian Network of Drug and Alcohol Services. Dr. Jackie Hallam is the CEO of the Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drug Council of Tasmania. Ellie Morrison is the Deputy CEO of the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League and was one of the people who helped develop this resource. And Jill Rundle, who I spoke of earlier, is the CEO of the Western Australian Network of Alcohol and Other Drug Agencies, who was part of the original conversations about the need for the development of these resources. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to James Dunne, who's going to do a bit of a show and tell on the resources and talk about the process that we went through for their development. James is the AADC Policy and Projects Coordinator, and take it away, James.
Well, thanks, Mel. I'll just share my screen if you bear with me for a second. Excellent. Thanks, Mel. Yeah, as Mel said, my name is James Dunne, and I'm the Policy and Project Coordinator for AADC. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Pangarang people and what we now call Northeast Victoria, and acknowledge the ongoing connection of the Pangarang to the place where I live and work. Sorry. So my presentation today focuses on the best practice guide and position statement that AADC has developed as a way to reduce the risk of negative outcomes when people with lived and living AOD experience share their stories in the media. The focus of this work is really on mainstream AOD services. We know that in these services there are frequently staff or board members in identified peer roles or who have their own lived and living experience. There's obviously clients who access services with their own lived experiences. And as well as family members who are connected with clients who access the services. And so while they might...
James, I'm just going to have to stop you for a sec because we can't see your screen.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's
Sorry,
try that
a bit
again.
of a tech fail.
How's that? Does that come up?
Yes, thank you.
There we go. Thanks, Mel. And so while there might be a bit of crossover, our focus here is not on peer-based organisations. ABLE and the members of the ABLE network are really experts in this context, and I'm sure that Ellie might touch on some of that work during our discussion panel, which speaks directly to the context of peer-based harm reduction and drug user organisations. And I'm really speaking on behalf of the working group that was established across our membership that helped put this guide and position statement together. These resources really drew from the direct experience and expertise of this working group, and as well in many cases of the members and the services on the ground that our members work with. I've listed everybody here on the screen, and there's a few too many to go through in detail, but I do want to shout out everybody for their role and their contribution to this work, as well as acknowledging some of the input that we've had from other national organisations like the Australian Women's Health Alliance. And lastly, also just acknowledge all the lived and living experience voices that have helped shape this document, and the sometimes positive but sadly frequently negative experiences that many have had in their interactions with the media. These resources are really developed to counter and prevent these negative experiences for anybody who chooses to share their story publicly. So anybody who's worked in the AOD sector for any length of time or ever picked up a newspaper or watched any TV reporting will know that alcohol and other drugs are a frequent topic of media reporting. And the angle of this reporting can vary. Sometimes it's focused on industry. We're talking about the alcohol industry. Sometimes it's on population health. Other times it might be on service provision. And frequently it's on issues of law and crime. But there's one element that's fairly consistent across all this reporting, and that's the inclusion of personal stories of alcohol and other drug use. So the media reporting and the sharing of these personal stories has the potential to challenge these stereotypes and deepen public understanding of AOD use, and empower individuals by sharing their voices, by platforming their voices in issues that really affect them. Anybody familiar with projects like the Lives of Substance Project from the National Drug Research Institute and partners will see the way that these personal stories highlight the diversity and experience of substance use and challenge the beliefs about who uses drugs and what it means to be somebody who uses drugs. And putting these stories out into the media provides similar opportunity to challenge these stereotypes. But AOD-related stigma is pervasive, and AOD-related stigma means that the sharing of personal stories in the media comes with significant risk. Any publicity of these stories has the potential to create a negative impact for the person sharing their story, even when these reporting is done sensitively. And some of these sorts of impacts include, impact on family relationships, where a family member might not be aware of somebody's drug use, a person feeling exposed and increasing their AOD use as a means to cope with this exposure and these feelings of vulnerability, increased attention from law enforcement and negative healthcare experiences following the publishing of personal stories, and at its most extreme end, suicide. And I want to share a very quick example of this and the way that sharing one's personal story can result in a whole range of negative consequences that go far beyond what might be initially expected. And so I don't want to drag this person's life back into the spotlight, so I'm going to talk about their story in some general terms. So this person attended a public forum that was being recorded by TV and put a question to a government minister in relation to a proposed tax cut for high-income earners. He stated that he had a disability and had largely worked in minimum wage jobs all his life. He stated that the tax cut would barely be noticed by high-income earners, but for him at the lower end of the income scale, a tax cut would be life-changing. It would mean the difference between being broke at the end of it every week and having some money left over to take his kids somewhere nice. He questioned why the government was pursuing this particular direction in its tax policy. So initially, print media picked up his story and there was some initial really positive reporting. But tabloid media then started to dig into the details of his distant past and published all aspects of his life, which included contact with the justice system and substance use. He later spoke about the impact of this experience on his own well-being and that of his kids. And at the time, advocacy groups for people on low incomes noted that they'd been in contact with other people in similar situations who have subsequently declined to participate in media interviews because of the way that this person was treated and for fear they would be treated in the exact same way if they shared their stories. So what this highlights is that once a person's story is out in the media, they have very little control over this and they risk their whole lives being investigated and reported on. So as I mentioned, the media frequently reports on AOD issues, and a common element of this reporting is personal stories. But how does the media access people who have lived and living experience? Frequently, this is done through AOD services, which may approach clients or peer staff and offer them the opportunity to share their experiences. So on the slide here, we've got a selection of print articles that feature personal stories of substance use. And even though they are public, I blanked out some of the identifying information of the participants as I don't want to unnecessarily put these people's stories back out into the public sphere. And this isn't to suggest that the stories are necessarily stigmatising, but more to emphasise the fact that once a personal story is out into the public sphere, the storyteller loses their ability to control their image and their story and risks a whole range of unknown and unintended consequences. So the common element of the articles here is that the journalist speaks to an AOD service, which discusses positive outcomes of its programs or identifies gaps in the system that might need addressing through government funding, and that a personal story is used to add some lived or living experience perspectives to complement this discussion on system issues or program outcomes. And although it's not explicit, what we can assume here is that a journalist might approach a service, and that journalist is then either requested access or been offered access to somebody with lived and living experience. And the service then approaches the clients or their peer staff to see who might be willing to share their story. So what we know is that AOD services can act as an access point for journalists and media organisations, and I'm sure many in our audience today would have their own experience of this. And given the role that AOD services play and the potential risk that it entails for those sharing their stories, how can AOD services enact a duty of care and decrease the risk of a negative outcome while still supporting the agency of clients and staff and challenging AOD-related stigma and discrimination? So in response to this, AADC held a members discussion forum where members supported the idea of developing a resource that captured the experiences and the best practices of those working in the sector as a way to provide guidance for other AOD services when they're approached by media. And to do this, as I mentioned and Mel mentioned, we established a working group from across our membership and developed the resources that we're launching today. The best practice guide and the position statement represent AADC and our members' commitment to supporting a safer environment for people with lived and living experience to tell their stories in a public forum and to challenge the AOD-related stigma and discrimination. So these resources are designed to be used and adapted across a number of levels. They could be a statement of principles that other organisations adapt and contextualise to their own environments, a set of practices that services can translate into organisational policies, and suggested actions that individual practitioners can keep in mind when they're approached by journalists for interviews. So I'm now going to step us through some of the details of the best practice guide. So in our working group discussions, what became particularly apparent early on was that there are a range of decision-making points and best practices that can be implemented to create a safer environment for lived and living experience storytelling. And this starts well before a journalist even approaches a service. And as such, the best practice guide is structured around these decision-making points. So the first of these is about deciding when to engage with the media. So before a journalist approaches a service for comment, there are a number of questions that services can consider and plan for to ensure a solid foundation for media engagement. These include questions like, what is the service's position on providing access to clients and staff with lived and living experience? Under what circumstances would they agree to an interview or decline an approach? And under what circumstances might they refer a journalist to a dedicated peer representative organisation like ABLE and the organisation's enabled membership? Another question is, how does the service want to see AOD issues framed in the media, and what type of media outlets would support this vision? The example we use in the guide is that a journalist might contact a service for a living experience story in relation to a new supervised injecting centre. A reactive story with a really short turnaround time is probably less likely to result in an article that aligns with the service's values or vision than a feature piece which is developed over a number of weeks and through a number of engagements with clients and the service. Another question to consider is, how comfortable are services allowing the independence, autonomy and freedom of expression for people with lived and living experience, which could result in a critique of that service or statements that don't necessarily align with the service's positions. And finally, another question is, how are issues of intersectionality going to be managed to ensure that those sharing their stories are not subjected to multiple forms of discrimination and stigma? And then when considering each individual media inquiry, the services can ask, what is the history of AOD reporting from this journalist or this media outlet? And that can help inform some of that decision-making about whether to proceed. So the guide also encourages services to think about what are the terms of participation, including the availability of anonymous participation or confidentiality, as well as asking journalists to read sector-developed language guides and include those in reporting. So when a person with lived or living experience volunteers to share their story, either prior to media contact or when the opportunity arises, we also identified a number of practices that services can implement. A first step would be planning prior to media engagements by providing training for people who want to share their story. Organisations such as NEWA in New South Wales and the AOD Consumer and Community Coalition in WA provide such courses that help people share their story in a public forum in a way that's safe and reduces the likelihood of a negative outcome. This might even result in a Speakers Bureau type arrangement, and I know ATDC in Tasmania have a similar program to this, which Jackie might speak to later on the panel. And when those opportunities arise, services can plan with the individual before they speak to the journalist. They might want to work through with the person about what parts of their story are they happy to share and what parts are off limits. Are they comfortable being identified, or would they like to be anonymized in some way? And at what point would the person withdraw their participation if they are unhappy with how the interview is going? And what can services do to support that withdrawal? And what are the possible outcomes of participating, and how would that person minimise or potentially manage the impact of those outcomes? And for friends and family, one question might be around, have they spoken with the family member who has that lived or living experience of substance use and sought their permission to tell their story? And then when we think about on the day when the interview is about to happen, services can help ensure the terms of participation are being met by the journalist through means such as offering the opportunity to have a trusted service representative sit in on the interview and make sure those terms of participation are being met. And as well as the work that happens prior to the interview and during the interview, we also thought it's really critical to look at what happens after the interview and debriefing with that person who shared their story, making referrals as appropriate, and identifying any issues of concern. And that's particularly important because these issues of concern can be communicated back to the journalist as quickly as possible and potentially addressed before any publication is made to air. And another element of this is documenting the outcomes, both positive and negative, of this engagement with journalists, so that organisational policies can continually adapt in response to practice. And finally, in addition to these more discrete approaches from journalists and media outlets, we identified a role for our sector to be working in a more systematic way to improve the environment for AOD reporting generally and lived experience storytelling specifically. These include communicating both the positive and negative experiences of working with a particular journalist or outlet through our networks or to our state, territory, or national peak organisations, so that others can make informed decisions when they're approached by that same journalist or same media outlet. We can also communicate positive and negative experiences back to the journalist, as this might be an opportunity to help the journalist understand the impact of stigma and improve their practice. And finally, we can also report particular concerns to the Australian Press Council or the Australian Communications and Media Authority. And the AOD Media Watch website has a really useful case study that steps people through that process and how to go about doing that. And so here I've primarily focused on our best practice guide, as it contains the most detail, but alongside this best practice guide sits a companion position statement. And as the name suggests, this states AADC's values and its position in relation to this issue. And I would encourage organisations to use this to inform their own organisational positions. So where can you find it? The resources are live on the AADC website now. There should be a link in the chat that will take you straight there, but if not, you can go to aadc.org.au and navigate to the resources page and you'll find everything there. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So I guess that's the summary, and those resources are now live on our website, as James said, and you can find them for yourselves. We're also going to be seeking everyone's help to proliferate these resources. So if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it really fall? There's no point us creating these things if you don't get out there and share them with your networks. We want to make sure that services are well equipped to deal with the media inquiries that might come in the context of the federal election campaign, and also well equipped to think about these things within the context of their own services and their own proactive media engagement as well, because as I kind of started with, sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and even with the best of intentions on behalf of services and journalists, these sort of engagements can go awry. And it's very, very important that you think about why you're wanting to do this, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to support anyone who does decide that they do want to share their lived experience story, even though they understand the risks involved. So this is really a bit of an attempt by us to provide some guidance and support to services in how they do manage that engagement. And it should be relevant too, not just in terms of media engagement, but engagement with politicians, with any of those sorts of forums, national inquiries, parliamentary inquiries, those sorts of things where people may be wanting to share their lived experience story and services are wanting to support them to do that. So what I might do is throw to one of our panelists to give her initial thoughts on this. Jenny, you wear multiple hats and have multiple perspectives in this space. So I'm really interested in your perspective on, I guess, the challenges that are there, your experiences in this space, and whether you think this is a good approach to services, getting some guidance on how to do this.
I'm very, very impressed by the best practice guide. First of all, having read through it, I was agreeing with all of it. Yeah, my experience is, I am a journalist. However, I put out an addiction memoir, Woman of Substances, in 2017. And so my exposure to the press was entirely self-inflicted, but it was quite exhaustive. It went on for 4 months. So it wasn't an on-off interview, one-off interview, it was constant. And much as I tried to control the narrative and be fiendishly prepared, at the end of the day, often what a journalist is looking for is, how bad did it get? Are you okay now? And there are questions in between, but they are digging for that kind of rock bottom to redemption story quite often, unless it's on a specific topic, such as, I don't know, the meth epidemic. But in my case, it was very, very impactful on my health, I have to say, because being so vulnerable with a stranger, possibly live on air, you know, over the course of maybe just 4 minutes, being asked the most personal questions, I found that my body was almost trying to shut down. I was breaking out in hives on my face whenever I had to do an interview. You know, in hunter-gatherer times, if we made ourselves this vulnerable, we might die. So I think we've still kind of got that mechanism in us that tries to prevent us from being vulnerable. So that really inspired me actually to become a media trainer for people with lived experience and really impress upon them, be really sure what you are comfortable with saying and what you're not, and to, you know, approach as much as possible, approach producers beforehand. This would probably be the service doing it, but, you know, really try and get across exactly what this is. Because yeah, there is a power imbalance, no matter how confident you are. And I was a pretty low risk person in that I don't have kids, so there wasn't going to be any fallout there. I was a freelance journalist and I didn't intend to be in full-time employment ever again. You know, I enjoyed the privileges of being white and middle class. My family lived in a different country, and I was talking about things that happened years ago. So you couldn't ask for a better setup in a way. Whereas potentially services might be asking someone who's brand new, newly minted sober. And I can say from experience that when you are brand new, newly minted sober, you're in a bit of a honeymoon period where you kind of feel like you've invented the wheel. You're feeling very aspirational. You are wanting to change your life, and you have this positive view of it. Potentially, you're going to be wanting to be a people pleaser, and to sort of see yourself as a good, redeemable person. So the temptation could be really strong for someone in very, very early recovery to put their hand up or agree to something. But I think those things have to be borne in mind. And it's important to, as I say, make sure everyone's really clear with, where is this story going to be published? Is it going to be syndicated elsewhere, which can sometimes happen without you being told? What's the format? I was working for a drug and alcohol organization after the book came out, and we placed a story where one of our clients was going to be interviewed, but it was an as told to piece, which is where the journalist writes it as if they are you. So it looks like it's in your own words. And it was really, really distressing for her, the reality of it, to see it sort of on the page. You know, I wouldn't have phrased things like that. You know, it was very important to her to be represented properly. And that became quite a thorny thing of, yeah, well, I guess those as told to pieces can be really confronting for people to see. So it's so important for any organization to figure out these things. And I would even suggest being proactive and pitching your own stories, maybe creating a bit of a calendar of things coming up that you could approach journalists about, whether it be, you know, Melbourne Cup, when you know that newspapers are reliably going to be shaming people about alcohol use, or, you know, the quarterly release of wastewater data, or World Hepatitis Day or Grand Final. You might just have a generic press release that's always ready to go, with quotes from your CEO, maybe quotes from somebody like an alumni of your service. that you can just update depending on the occasion.
I think these are all really good tips, but I think, you know, it's really important for services to understand that, I mean, you're a really polished person, Jenny. You're a journalist yourself. You knew exactly what you were getting into, and even so, it had such a huge impact on you, that engagement. So I think that's something that people need to bear in mind for sure.
Oh, and one more thing, sorry. You know, the lasting legacy of your Google results. That was really distressing for me for about a year, because if I Googled my name, it was all sort of trauma, this, addiction, that. Because I'm a journalist, eventually, because I've got quite an output, things would, those results sort of trickled away. But that's not a luxury that most people have.
I think these are all really good points, and it goes to that idea that things stay on the internet for a long time. Like when we were younger, if you did something on telly, it went away the next day, and it was only the people who'd seen it on telly that night that got to see it. But some of this stuff stays around for a long time, and I think for services, particularly those working with young people, you need to understand that someone might think they're ready to tell their story now, but have they thought about the implications this could have if that information sits there in perpetuity on the internet? So it's not just about whether someone thinks they're ready to share their story. It's, as services, we've got a duty of care to tell them if we don't think they should. I might throw to Ellie now. ABLE and its member organisations have had obviously vast amounts of experience in this space. What are your thoughts on the guide, the process? You were part of the team that wrote the thing. What are your initial thoughts now that we're at this point?
Thanks, Mel. I think it is really important. Some of the things I really like about the guide is that thinking beforehand and being prepared to support people and to prepare your own organisations around working with media. Often what we do find with particularly media and journalists is that they are looking for a particular story, and we are approached and there's a time limit, and you feel this pressure to respond because they need to put their story out the next day, and you just can't do that with people. For us, we do have quite a lot of experience at ABLE as a 40-year organisation of people who use drugs, and we have member organisations in every state and territory that also have a lot of experience, at least 40 years for some of them. And so we've seen it all. We have seen people, our friends, ourselves, who've lost children, who lost jobs, and so we've got that experience. We do know quite a lot about how to work with the media and how to try and change the power dynamic a little bit, where you do ask for, we need more time, we need to make sure that we have the right kind of story, and that the person that's going to speak is the right person to speak to that and knows what it is. Because as you've said, these things, they're online forever. Even before we had the internet, there were people who were remembered for years afterwards being part of some of Australia's major TV shows and current affairs type shows, and they'd be recognised on the street. And they wanted to show their story. They wanted to do something for our community and show a different side of things, but you cannot control the narrative once it's out there. It's just impossible. So you have to be as prepared as you possibly can be, and we have to be ready to be prepared as well. So I guess my main message at the moment would be that if you are an organisation that works with people who use drugs and you are approached, that the first thing I would do is talk to your member organisation of people who use drugs in your state or territory, or talk to us at ABLE and just get a bit more information from us about what we think might be the best path forward.
I think that's a really important point, because sometimes just because your service has been approached by a journalist because they've Googled drug treatment and they've come up with your service, doesn't necessarily mean that it's your service who is best placed to respond, or that indeed it needs to be a client of yours that needs to speak. sometimes it's better to defer to people who have more experience in this space and also have access to people who are really prepared to do this. So I think leaning on that, the AVIL network, AVIL has member organisations in each state and territory, and you can either contact AVIL or those services directly to get some help and advice on how you might want to go forward. I might throw next to Jill. Jill, I want to tap you just because you were part of the initial conversation about why we needed this resource. And I want to talk to you about and hear your perspectives on the need for this resource, and also some of the cautionary tales and stories of how media engagement has played out in the sector over time. Would you like to share some of that wisdom with the group?
Sure, thank you. And I don't think, thank you. I just, before I start, would like to acknowledge that I'm joining the webinar today from Wajak Noongar Budja, so the land's in Perth, and like to pay my respects to elders past and present here. I think it's fantastic. We've got a guide, and services need to be, can draw on this guide to inform their own policies, their own checklists, if you like. And there's been many, you know, anyone who's been in the sector for any length of time, and I've been in the sector for, you know, many decades, so has seen this repeated experience of people who are willing to share or have put themselves forward or have become involved in media or any sort of public engagement. And I think this translates, it's not just media, it's any sort of public engagement. And one thing, you know, which is fantastic that we've got a guide. I think one thing that hasn't been spoken about yet that I think is a cautionary tale to remember is to have a contingency plan for if things go bad. And repeatedly I've seen people go, this was great, this was a great interview, or this was a great presentation, I feel comfortable with what I shared, and then there are the consequences. And so having that contingency plan ready and talking through the contingency plan with the person who might be sharing their story in advance is something really important to do. I think it's already been said in regards to, you know, how long your exposure after sharing this story can go on, particularly in the media, you know, and employment and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The sort of language that's often used and shared in social media and that's stigmatising, discriminating against people is truly, truly devastating. So we do need to be looking after people, especially if there's a service that has supported somebody, they need to continue that support into the future for, you know, when the consequences of this become more apparent. So yes, fantastic. Congratulations on AADC for putting together this guideline. WINATA will definitely be advocating for this for its member services in Western Australia. We will be more conscious of it. One more thing, if I could just say that WINATA's recently undertaken some research on lived and living experience leadership. So in supporting, you know, what needs to be considered in people contributing to policy and sector development and reform, et cetera, et cetera. And the key issue, one of the key issues that has come out of that report is a recognition of the diversity of people's perspectives. So an individual story is just an individual story. And I think wherever possible, we need to be saying there is a diverse range of perspectives of people with lived and living experience. And this is one perspective. I don't know how, but, you know, this is something that we will definitely be encouraging any service to be, you know, contributing to as well, that there are a diversity of perspectives, and we need to be supporting voice of lived and living experience, because that is how we will get effective policies and reform into the future. Thank you.
I think that's some really, really important points there, Jill, you know, and I guess what you're saying is if 46% of the population has used an illicit drug at any one time, at any stage in their lives, as the statistics indicate, you're trying to say they're not all the same and their experiences aren't all the same? What a revolutionary idea, Jill. So I think what you're pointing to as well is that when people engage with media stories, their lived experience needs to be relevant to that. So someone who has a history of injecting drug use may not be the person to share their story if it's about the Melbourne Cup and excessive alcohol use, because indeed people's lived and living experience is diverse and not homogenous, and people are different and drug users are not all the same. And I think our colleagues in the Aboriginal community controlled sector will understand the frustration of media agencies that are looking for a homogenous story. And I think that's something that you're right, we do need to think about really hard in this sector as well.
The intentionality, if I can just say that, you know, be intentional with how the story, how the information is, or, you know, why are you doing this? Thank you.
I think that's really important, and it goes to Ellie's point as well about not feeling like you have to wheel someone out just because you've been asked to. It has to serve the purposes of the organisation and the sector more broadly, not just feel like you've got to do it. And that was something that Jenny touched on too, in terms of people feeling like they had to share things because they want to please people. I think the same goes for services. You don't have to please that journalist if it doesn't serve your broader purpose. Jackie, I think I might throw to you because I know you've got some comments to make on reactive versus proactive media that kind of follow on from what we were just talking about.
Thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Muanina people in Hobart, Tas, and thanks for having me as part of this panel. We've done a lot of work in this area, and I guess just a couple of overall reflections before I go into that topic, is that we have a lot of policies and procedures. We have a communications charter. The way that we engage our advocates with the media and indeed other work that they do, that's reflected at the level of our risk register as well. And another reflection that I'd like to make thinking through all of this is that I feel very fortunate here because we have been provided funding to implement our comms charter. So that means that we have a resource to be able to contact and work with the media, go and meet with them, talk with them. And I guess the other thing on our side with that one is that there aren't many media outlets here. So if we were in, I imagine, a larger city, that would be a whole bigger task. But because we're in Tasmania, I can probably think of about 5 or 6 individuals that I have in my phone, and I'm able to text. And so, for example, if we see something in the media which we think requires, to get in touch with them so they can change something or a word, it's very easy for us to do that. So we are fortunate to that level. We're also fortunate to have funding from the government to run what people might see as a consumer rep service. We call it the Lived Experience Advocate Service. And as part of that, we have some really great staff that are able to work really, really closely with our people that do media for us. So just giving a bit of context there. There is a lot of work that goes into this to make sure that we have a duty of care to the people that we ask to work with the media. We provide media training, and we have a media consultant who also works with people who work with the media, and they're always there. So if it's something which involves a appearance which is going to be on the news that night, and sometimes it can feel a little bit rushed and so on, we always make sure that I am there or our media consultant is there too. So there are loads of other things that we do, just sharing a few bits and pieces that we think reduces risks and makes sure that people are safe when they do these sorts of things. Now, going on to the reactive and proactive side of things, I'm glad that Jenny mentioned the wastewater. issue, which comes up a few times a year. And we often get a phone call on the day from someone in the media who already has a narrative there about crystal meth issue in Devonport, people getting off the boat and saying that crystal meth has tripled and it is a huge crisis. Can you find someone to talk about this? We have to very much sit back and say, we query your narrative to start with based on the actual data itself. And so it is extremely likely that no, we absolutely can't find someone at short notice in 45 minutes to talk to you about a crystal meth crisis in Devonport. This happens regularly. So what we try and do with that one is to, I mean, we usually would have an existing, we would already know that person who has reached out. And so we would be able to say, look, can we talk about this issue more broadly? And we'll talk about it later, and we'll work out something whereby we can explore maybe what drug use might look like, and we'll sit back and we'll think about it, and then we'll go back to them with a more health-based narrative. And we always like to keep those sorts of things. One of the things that we actually find works is to keep the information quite high level. So rather than going down into someone's story at a granular level, if we keep it at a high level and health and focus it on broad health experiences, that will then bring the risk down as well. Now, the other thing that we've had success with is using public polling. So we've got on the front foot and polled the public around drug checking. And we've actually found that 2/3 of the Tasmanian of people actually are in favour of it. So I think for quite a long time, people have thought that the Tasmanian public are conservative, and it's actually not. It's actually not the case. So we're then able to take our time with that public polling to challenge what people actually think about drug use, and it's actually shown to be not true with the regard of this particular example. And then talk about drug checking in an empowered way, and keeping the messages high level and about health, about the value, about the evidence, and those sorts of things. So we've been able to help shape the narrative on issues of concern to people with a living and lived experience, because we know that our people down here with a lived and living experience are very concerned about the fact that we don't have drug checking. So we're able to use public polling and then again challenge those wider issues that people think that we have with the Tasmanian public, which are not true, and so on and so forth. So that's just a way that we've been able to be proactive with it and using the lived experience voice. And we're also quite, we talk regularly. We have a community of practice, and they, through that process, will identify issues which are of concern for them, and then we can work and so on and be proactive in the media. I'll stop talking now, Mel. I hope that was useful.
No, it was, and I think that's a really important point. It's something that we cover in the guide. You don't have to just be reactive, you can be proactive, and part of it is around setting the agenda and getting across the messages that we as services and the sector want to get across, rather than just responding on things like wastewater data, which we won't talk about because we could talk about that all day. But it's about setting the agenda and getting the messages across that we want to get across, not, I use this word facetiously, but not enabling journalists in the pursuit of tabloid points. So I think that's a really important point that you make there too. Michael, I might go to you now, just because I know that Sanders has done a media stigmatising of AOD use report that looks at the South Australian media context in particular. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you found and what your experiences have been? Because I know you've had a bit of a hard time in South Australia with some of the media agencies there.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, I'd like to just acknowledge that we're on Kaurna country here and pay my respects, and also acknowledge people with lived and living experience and the contribution that they make to the sector. We were very fortunate a couple of years ago. We take a couple of students on placement every semester. And we had 3 students who had no background in drug and alcohol, and I asked them to do a paper on media stigma. And they engaged with Jenny and another local journalist here, interviewed lots of people, collated a whole lot of material, and they came up with a rubric, the kind of rubric that a year 10, 11, 12 student uses for doing an assessment of a media story. And I'd really encourage people to either use that rubric or some other rubric and go and have a look at some of the historic stories that are on AOD Media Watch and work out why you've got a problem with them, because it helps you frame what you want to say to a journalist to know where journalists can go wrong. Put it that way. So a little bit of homework before you get involved in this. Also think that one of the things that we learnt was that there are actually different kinds of journalists. And there is a journalist. That's a person who's unbiased, looking for a factual story, wanting to report the kind of facts, the news, you know, the kind of people we see in war zones, telling you how it really is. Then there are journalists who are writers. They want to create a narrative. They want to tell a story. And they're not really interested in the impact of the story other than its impact as a story. And we've got a number of journalists in South Australia who have been problematic because they love that hero of, you know, the hero story about the one person who got through drug and alcohol, hit rock bottom, and then they've come back and they've designed a plan that's going to help everybody else in their community. And really quick example, one of those stories ran, I looked at it and I thought, I've never heard of this hero person. I phoned 3 of the people who were referred to in that story and said, do you know this guy? Because he's used your name and essentially your address to create his position. And they all went, nah. And one of the people said, I can't tell you anything about that person. I'm not going to talk about that person. So I went back to the journalist and said, hi, young journalist, straight out of journalism school, rural, working in the rural area. I said, did you do any fact checking on this guy? You know, he claims to be running a whole number of things. He claims to be a registered charity. Did you do any fact checking? Oh, no, I just met him and we had a chat and I said I'd do a story on him and I did a story. I said his charity had an income of below $5 last year and it had expenses of $2,000. I said, you need to check this thing out. So I often will have those conversations. And the final type of journalist, and this really concerns me because these are the ones that I find I get trapped by, are the ones who've got an agenda of their own. You know, they've either got a political agenda or they're aligned to a particular political philosophy, or they've got their own, we all have biases, but they have their own biases. And they're kind of media tribal players, you know, they'll play on behalf of different stakeholder groups like politicians or police. And you tend to get stories about, you know, what Jackie was saying, you know, the streets are awash with people using meth kind of stories. And that can be really problematic. And with all of those journalists, I think, and this is really important message that comes through in the guide, will the story make a difference? Is there a point to telling this story? And I'm starting to think with wastewater, there's no point responding to wastewater, because I can tell you when the wastewater figures go up, I get a phone call at 5:30 in the morning to be on the ABC. And when they go down, it's crickets. Don't hear a thing. So you're going to be able to change opinion? reduce stigma? Are you going to be able to get a story out that helps the position that you want? And lastly, people have touched on this, but think through the perverse outcomes of a story, because stories can have profoundly perverse outcomes. I can think of a number where we've gone in to have a really, thought we did a really, really good chat. And then when you look at the feedback the next day or the follow-up story the next day, the whole world is awash with things that you didn't want discussed, etc. And it's really important to think about that, not just at the individual, but also at your organisation and at the sector level. What are we doing? How are we talking about stuff that's going to influence the whole sector? I think you go back to the Hippocratic Oath in conclusion, which is do no harm or try and do no harm. And it's a tricky line to walk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think you make some important points. But yeah, first of all, do no harm. I think that's a good principle to start with for anyone in any context, really. Now, I'm going to go to some questions from the audience soon. So before that, I'm going to throw to Jenny for her to change hats and give us some thoughts from a journo perspective on what Michael was just talking about. But before I throw to Jenny, I've got a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A now. Just for people playing at home, please don't punch your questions into the chat because that's not where we're going to be getting them from. Please punch your questions into the Q&A section. You won't be able to see them coming in, but I will, and I will ask them of the panel and we'll go that way. So there are a couple sitting there that are open that I'll get to in a sec. But please put in some questions. If you've got any questions about anything that's in the guide or any questions that you have for any of the panelists about their experiences, I'm going to talk a little bit after we ask Jenny for her perspective about perverse outcomes and get the panel to elaborate on some of those, because I think there's some more cautionary tales in there for young players. But in the meantime, Jenny, can you please put on your journalist hat and just talk a little bit about what Michael's just talked about? I know you're involved in that project, but also in terms of the experiences that you've had in doing media training with organisations. What are some of the tips and tricks for young players that you would have from those experiences?
Well, first off, something I heard Michael say and a few other people was really along the lines of should organizations be putting people forward necessarily? And I find myself agreeing with that more. I think of it as well. I do think there's a real value to people talking about lived experience. And I do some work with Unharm, where it's a speakers bureau, but they're people who are out of the woods. And it's people who've decided there's a public good to be found in sort of normalizing the topic of drug use. And I don't know how successful they are with actually placing these stories, because there's not, maybe an emergency or tragedy attached to it, but it's a very different scenario to an organization putting someone forth. And also on the topic of Media Watch, AOD Media Watch, there's also a section called exemplars, but so you can look up which journalists and stories have done a really good job, and they're not always the most obvious ones. There's a few really good Herald Sun ones up there. Personally, one of my worst experiences was with the ABC, with a really seasoned, well-loved presenter. So you can never really tell. I think the main problems with the media are it's very reductive. So somebody will be turned into practically a meme. So their story and their experience will be reduced probably beyond what they're comfortable with, which can end up reinforcing stereotypes. And also, as we've mentioned before, there's that tendency to go for a rock bottom to redemption story, and have somebody who's all better now, and it doesn't allow for the nuance, the reality of someone's life, which is okay. You might no longer be taking substances, but that doesn't mean your life isn't still in flux. So that then presents this kind of almost almost sort of Christian good, bad redemption narrative that I think is quite unhealthy. Yes, so I mean, so in terms of what people can do if they are being put forth or putting someone forth, I think it's great to have some sound bites ready to go. And particularly if it's something like radio or a phone interview, you can have them written down. And it might just be 3 points you really want to make. And I have to say, I don't think any journalist is going to be interested in an organization's values. So doing a sound bite around that could be a waste of time. Essentially, they are looking for a story. They're looking for a human interest story. So another good thing to do is think of a really kind of colorful, vivid scene. So if there's something that's happened to you as the person with lived experience that you're happy to share, if you can make that as colorful and bring it to life as much as possible, that will be the irresistible thing that the journalist wants to go with, because you've wrapped it up in a bow for them. So I think those two things would be my main points, plus being really sure what you don't want to say. You can potentially ask to see, I think, James, in the guide it says, ask for the finished piece and things like that. I think that was pretty rare. Myself as a journalist, if somebody was quite anxious about giving an interview, I'd be prepared to call them and read just their quotes to them. But anything else is asking for trouble, because either the interviewee or somebody else connected to them is going to want to, get the red pen out and try and rewrite the thing. So there's some pointers. Is there anything else you were looking for, Mel?
No, I think those are some really good points as well. I'm going to throw to some questions for the audience now, but I think, what Jenny's talked about is really valuable in terms of how we engage in thinking about what journalists are going to find interesting. So I think to what Ellie said about the experience that drug user organisations, ABLE and its member organisations in the states and territories are really important, and ties in with what Jenny was just saying about someone who is a bit down the track in terms of their lived experience. Certainly in the conversations that we had that led to the creation of this resource, there was some really prominent media reporting that featured people who clearly wanted to tell their story, and services had clearly enabled them to tell their story with very well-meaning intentions. But it was clear to us that these were either very young people or people who were quite vulnerable and still undertaking treatment, who really should have been discouraged from sharing their story at that point, because there were some issues around informed consent in terms of the sharing of their story and whether they're in a position to know whether it would be a good idea or not. And so I guess what we were keen to explore in terms of the best practice guide was the role of services as gatekeepers. Just because you can help someone to tell their story doesn't mean it's necessarily a good idea for them or for your service. And I think that's something that we're really asking services to think about. And the guide takes you through, I guess, a lovely checklist of things that you may not have thought of, and prompts you to give those things some thought. It doesn't ultimately give you a formula of yes, do it now, and no, don't do it under these circumstances, but it does take you through the issues that you should be considering before you make a decision kind of either way. Now, I'm going to go to the questions, and thanks everyone for starting to punch those in. First, we've got more of a comment here from Emma from Shark, who's just wanting to share that the Association of Participating Service Users at Shark, the Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre, has a database of members who are trained in telling their story, and they also have a speaker bureau. They're a peer-led organisation with an extensive database of people with diverse experiences, and they also provide peer support, assisting our members to make informed decisions. And we also assist people throughout the process. And they would be very happy to hear from any services who would like their assistance as well. Now, this one is a really interesting question, and one that I'm really glad that this person's asked, because I was going to bring it up myself if no one did. An anonymous attendee is asking, I am wondering if there's any guidance about using lived and living experience stories in online training workshops and webinars. They are often recorded and would have similar risk attached, maybe on the smaller scale. And this is a really important question, because it also goes to conferences and events that people probably think are going to a closed audience, but then particularly if they're successful events, might end up being shared either publicly or through networks in a way that hadn't initially been envisaged. So who on the panel would like to take this one up first? Has anyone had some experience with these types of events having adverse consequences as well as media engagement? I might take that one then initially, just because I can. That's the joy of being in the chair. I probably a year and a half ago facilitated the engagement of someone with some lived experience to tell their story. It was an Aboriginal man who told his story in the context of a get-together of Indigenous people from around the world. So it was a small audience, and we were very, very careful about how that event played out. So we made sure that everyone who went knew that this information wasn't to be shared. We stopped there from being a recording of the event. So in effect, they couldn't actually share it even if they wanted to. And even though this person was very excited to tell their short story in the way that Jenny sort of outlined and said in the event, indeed, if anyone wants to share my story, please go ahead. I'm happy to help anyone. If my story will help people, please do share it. I was very careful to shut that down and to ensure that everyone at the event knew that there would be no sharing of the story, even in a retelling way, without specific permission. And it was really interesting afterwards because a number of the services from Canada actually, who were there at the event, wanted to share the story afterwards. And when I went back to the person to say, hey, look, we've had an inquiry from this service about wanting to share your story, how do you feel about that? It was really clear that the person hadn't thought it through. And even though they had said at the time they really wanted to share their story with whoever wanted to hear it, subsequent to that, they had some thoughts about that. And that was about family, largely, about whether there were people within the network who would talk to family members. And the person, while they were happy to share their own story in that shared audience, they hadn't really thought through the impact on family if the story was shared within networks that their family was part of. So I think that's a really important point. It's not just about mainstream media. It's about how shared stories are shared in the context of other events, whether that be webinars, workshops, conferences, whatever. You need to be really careful as a service to make sure you understand whether these events are going to be recorded and make sure you understand how far that could go. So I think that's a really important point. Does anyone else have any further comments on what I just said, Jackie?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could just jump in quickly there. I guess it's important to remember that we can always de-identify people, and there are ways in which stories can be told. It's not always going to be on video or your name in print, and I think sometimes by doing that you can, for whatever reason it is, without going too far, just for the sake of doing it. But if you know why you are sharing the story and you're confident that it will link to a good outcome, and I can think of a few examples, then sometimes taking people's personal whether it's their face and their name and so on, or any other identifying features too, because sometimes people are in communities that are small, so it's not just about name and face and so on. But I think there are ways in which I think that you can enhance people's privacy, confidentiality. But the other thing I would like to raise as well is that sometimes we will get a request to talk to the media, and the request will come from one person. It might be a producer, and so we think we know what we're going in to talk about, and then sometimes when you actually go in to do it, you're talking to somebody else who is a reporter, and they ask very different questions. And it is very much the reality when we do most media engagements that I prepare on something only to be asked something completely different. And whether that's because they're two separate people or they've evolved the questions since when they made the request in the first place. So I think being aware that curveballs are definitely part of this landscape. And so to enable people to have the confidence and feel that they can say, I don't wish to answer that question, or I'm not best placed to answer that question, or just knowing that, you know, that they don't have to answer it. So that's part of something as well, I think, to enable people to interact safely.
I wouldn't mind just making a comment on that. And I know that I've advocated in regards to the reuse of anything that's recorded and advocated for it to be not used. People, you know, as Jenny beautifully demonstrated, people's narrative changes. Or you know, your position or your vulnerability changes, the context of how things are used again and again changes. And so I just think it is, you know, to some extent unethical to continue to, you know, perpetuate somebody's experience or that level of vulnerability for wherever they were in that context. So I think that's, you know, let's not do that. Let's not encourage that, is all I can say.
I think those are important points. And building on that, we've got an interesting question here about a specific scenario. And Ellie, get ready, because I'm going to throw this one to you initially, I think. This person has asked, I'm working with someone now who is quite proud that the local media once called him a quality control officer for the local bikies. I'm curious about that tension between addressing and challenging people's internalised stigma versus giving them autonomy and authority back to them, or believing them when they say they're okay to do it. Ellie, do you want to comment on that one?
I'm happy to comment on that one. Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I 100% agree that it's not up to us to make decisions for people. I think it's up to us to give people as much information as we can about our experience and what we know can happen. Try and talk to people about the kind of language, do a bit of research maybe with that person, on the journalist or the person that's wanting to do the piece, and support them as much as possible to make the best decision for themselves. It's not up to us to make the decision for people necessarily. It's up to us to help inform them as best we can.
Can I jump in really quickly with that one, just briefly?
Yeah, go for it, Jenny.
I was thinking, you know, if I don't know if this person's sober now, but just because someone is doesn't mean they necessarily want to lose their identity or what it previously was, or all facets of it. I mean, some people completely embrace a new identity. This is me now, whereas others, you know, they're still quite attached to parts, at least, of who they were before, and there might be some kind of pride in that description, and some kudos to be had. So I got how that person might have been feeling, if I've interpreted that right.
And can I say something else as well? I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for a person to feel pride in aspects of their story. Like what we often see in the media is there's only one narrative. It's you're redeemed and therefore you're no longer using drugs. When you use drugs, your life was chaotic and awful. Or it's you're currently using drugs and your life is chaotic and awful. And that's not actually the case for most people. When we try and put forward as peer-led community-controlled drug use organisations stories about what is actually the case for most people who use drugs, which is that we are employed and we do have housing and we do have families, we're often told that's not the narrative we want for this one. We actually want one of the others that perpetuates the stereotype about people who use drugs being unable to control their own lives. And that's not actually the case for most people. And anything that we can do to show positive stories wherever a person's journey may be, I think we should be able to do it.
I think that's a really important point, and it's beholden on us as organisations and certainly as sector representatives to point out as well and to continue to reinforce the fact that it's, depending on which you look at the report, it's between 40 and 50% of the population that have used illicit drugs at some point in their life, you know, and the vast majority of them are not worst case scenario. And it doesn't matter how much people enjoy a montage, That's not the way it is. Everyone wants the Rocky montage, right? With the dude ending up at the top of the stairs with his arms in the air and everyone's a winner. But that's not necessarily how real life works. And I think that goes to that broader point around the diversity of experiences as well. I think that's really important. I've got a question here, and it goes to how much...
Can I just add something
Yeah,
there?
go for it, Michael.
One of the reasons that the press run that narrative is that they actually don't understand the experiences of people who use drugs. So I come out of a couple of meetings this week where I've said, look, 70% of people who use drugs won't ever need treatment and they won't ever get into trouble with drugs. They just use drugs because they're happy to use drugs. And there's fairly good data to show that around about that 70% of people won't do that. And then in this morning's meeting, my comment was, which was around young people in the youth justice system, most of the kids who get picked up for using drugs are not actually drug dependent. They don't need drug treatment. They're probably experimenting, they're exploring, they're doing stuff with their peers, but they don't actually need a mandated youth treatment order, which was what we were talking about. And people go, really? So people use drugs and don't get into trouble with them? Wow, where did you get that, Mike? Well, I've never heard that before. But that's the level of public engagement with these issues. At the same time that you can go out to a conference or something and talk to 8 CEOs who were on medical cannabis and they think nothing about it, you know. So how do we get that message into the media that the vast majority of people who the media wants to demonise about drugs are actually just living perfectly functional lives?
I think it's about analogies too. You know, not everyone who drinks alcohol needs treatment for alcohol dependence either. And that's an analogy that I often use with journalists. You know, I'm sure you had a drink on the weekend, and if you did, do you need to go to alcohol and other drug treatment now? No? Well, that's kind of what we're talking about, but it's an important point to make as well and goes to those stereotypes. There's a question here that I'm going to take offline. Jenny, a lot of people are loving your work on this event here today and are wanting to know how to contact you. If people would like to contact AADC, we can hook you up with Jenny after the event. Okay, so next question. Our organisation was mentioned in a media story last year and we were asked for a consumer story to go with it. We declined that offer only to find that they had found one elsewhere. We weren't happy with the narrative that story lent the piece. The excuse the reporter gave was it was the editor's choice and out of the reporter's control. And in a lot of situations, you were powerless over the end product. That is a really important point. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons we've developed this best practice guide, because that is a very common experience. And we want to try and increase the awareness of the issues across the sector so that that doesn't happen quite as often as it does now. Would anyone else like to comment on that in particular? Jenny, from wearing your journalist hat again, that's obviously not a great way to do the story, to talk about a service and then pick a random person to attach to that story. What's the imperative there? Why would the person feel like they had to do that?
Yeah, first of all, that's really horrible. So I'm sorry that happened. They probably did have the editor on their back saying we need that human interest angle and they're not supplying it. Find one. And you're right, you are powerless at the end. So it's, you know, there's not much you can do about that. I can say that most, if not all, legacy media have their editorial guidelines online and you can read them. This is after the horse is bolted, so it's too difficult. But if you're worried about something that's in progress, I managed to get a re-edit of an interview that happened with me on the ABC because I knew they'd violated so many of the ABC's own guidelines that I called up the producer and told them. In a situation like this, it's just really unfortunate. And yeah, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, a lot of unfortunate things. But I guess what we're trying to do in responding to that is to make organisations more aware of that and try and ensure that other organisations aren't facilitating that sort of thing. We can't control necessarily what the media does, but we can hopefully have some influence over how the sector responds to those kind of requests going forward. Now, this is an interesting one. Ellie, I think I'm going to go to you first for this one too, so heads up, mate. Should people sharing their stories be paid by the AOD organisation approached by the media?
That's an interesting question. To be honest, I'm not sure I can answer that. I would like to just say one thing before this, that there's a link as well to a resource that ABLE has done around some pointers on the types of framing that journalists and media can do when talking about people who use drugs. And that might be something that you could direct them to if you are thinking that they might not understand much about our community and people who use drugs. In terms of paying people, I don't know that it's a bad thing necessarily, but we've had some really, what we've seen more often is journalists paying people to do something that will then be used to stigmatise them more. So, for example, we've seen many times around the Richmond area in Melbourne, journalists giving people money so that they could score drugs, and then the journalists could film the people injecting. They've placed people in front of the school that's fairly close to the injecting room. So that kind of thing is just unbelievably outrageous. In terms of AOD organisations that are helping put someone in front of a journalist, then I would say it's something that you do have a bit of responsibility for. You're asking for someone to share their story, their time, their expertise, and it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for them to be paid for that, just as long as it's not something that's used for that person to then have a further worse outcome.
I think those are some good thoughts about unintended consequences there too. Thanks, Ellie. Okay. Let me go to another question here. It would be great to hear the panel's perspective on drug user community-controlled media as a strategy to ensure our experiences are not framed in ways that perpetuate unintended narratives. And I think that's an important point as well around what we previously spoke about around deferring to your drug user organisation in your states and territories too. Ellie, I'm going to go to you obviously, but then I might go to Jill on this one too.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
It would be great to hear the panel's perspective on drug user community-controlled media as a strategy to ensure our experiences are not framed in ways that perpetuate unintended narratives. So it goes to that broader proactive media stuff as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have, as we already talked about, some really experienced organisations in each state and territory. Not all of them have funding, not all of them have a lot of capacity to be doing their own media in a regular way, but there is definitely a case to be made for promotion of some of the really great magazines, some of the great websites and information that we've used in our organisations to share some of the different kinds of stories that we don't see quite so often. So yeah, I think it's great.
Excellent.
Yes, and I totally agree. I think it's absolutely. And this responds to the previous question, which you didn't read out, Mel, which is about the paternalistic sort of control over that, we don't, services need to raise awareness, but if it's community controlled, then absolutely, then this is the empowerment that we want to support. And obviously there will be continuous quality improvement and risks considered, et cetera, where we can eventually get this right so that the community, get the message that the the drug user community actually want to get across.
Excellent. Thanks, Jill. And you did that beautiful segue that I was going to do for me. Thank you. Around paternalism. And it goes to that tension that we talk about in the guide around empowering people to tell their stories versus duty of care in helping people make informed decisions. And I think there's no simple answer there, but what the guide provides is a framework for consideration of particular circumstances, so you can kind of strike that balance a bit better. James, I'm about to throw to you because I think you've got some examples in terms of webinars and that earlier question that we had.
Yeah, so just to go back to that question, I think, what we've put in the guide, although we're talking specifically about the context of media and reporting, the general theme is about putting a story out into a public forum and having that, consumed by other people, that not necessarily, like a one-to-one interaction, and you don't have control over that story once it gets out. So we've sort of, in the guide, we've deliberately been not like really prescriptive about what organisations should be doing. And this, I guess, comes back to that paternalism question, but really posing a lot of questions for services to think about, how would you want this to happen? What could you do about this aspect? And, encouraging that bit of contextualising to their own environment. So I think the guide gives some pointers for that sort of public forum webinar type context as well, and I think that could be adapted across. But I also did just want to highlight there was a specific resource that we've put in our appendix from the network of alcohol and other drug organisations at NADA in New South Wales. So they've got one called the Lived and Living Experience Speakers Guide that speaks to that specific context about conferences and webinars and that kind of thing. So that could be useful for that question, for that person who asked the question. But just going back to that issue about that paternalism, it is that really fine line, and we really kind of sort of discussed with that at length in the working group around how do you support people to tell their story and put their story out there and challenge this AOD related stigma, but also make sure that you're not putting people in an unsafe situation. And I think what we've hoped to get with this guide is to try and step through some of those scenarios and plan for the kind of outcomes that might occur and how they could be managed, how they could be prevented, and trying to, we're never going to eliminate that risk entirely, but if we value the voice of people with lived and living experience, we can try and minimise it as much as possible when they choose to tell their story publicly.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Now, there's more fans of Jenny here wanting to get in touch with her. You guys just email us, melanie.walker@aadc.org.au or james.dunne@aadc.org.au, and we're happy to facilitate a connection with Jenny after the event for you. Now, we've got a couple of plugs for some other resources that are either there or in development. Shark has developed a resource called 3 Sides of the Coin, through the 3 Sides of the Coin project. And you can get some information about that via 3sidesofthecoin.org.au. That has some lived experience stories and videos involved with it. Also, Quiver is developing an AOD lived and living experience representation guide that has been co-designed around 10 principles of AOD lived and living experience, and these include ethical storytelling and consent frameworks as well. And if you'd like a copy of that once it's released, you can get in touch with Manna at Quiver, or you can contact us and we will hook you up. Now, I want to go to a question here. And I think this is a really important one, noting that we're getting to the end of the show here. How does living experience fit into the redemption narrative? And I think that goes to really that broader question that keeps coming through around proactive versus reactive engagement with the media and the idea of diverse experiences. Who would like to take that one, which is probably our last question for today? Jenny.
I'll be really brief because my answer is a bit negative, unfortunately. I'm assuming living experience means current use. Yeah. I don't think it does fit into the redemption narrative in the media's eyes. I don't think they are particularly interested in harm minimization, for instance, because it's just not neat it's not reductive enough. I'll let somebody else jump in as well, though.
I'm going to go glass half full on this, mate, with my chair's prerogative. I think it's beholden on us to educate the media, and it's also about how we frame the outcomes of engagement with AOD services. People living their best lives is a good outcome. It doesn't necessarily equal abstinence, and it's beholden on all of us to do better in terms of educating the media around that. Ellie?
Just on the simplest level, people who use drugs, who are currently using drugs, who are doing amazing things within their own communities, I think that's a positive story. Doesn't have to be about redemption. It's just what we do. Like, we are people within the community and we care about our own health, we care about our communities, and like there's so many examples of that. So that's all I want to say. Thanks.
And I think leaning back on that statistic around how many people, it's half the community that use illicit drugs at some time or other in our lives. Not all of them need to have a redemption story. Not all of them need to run to the top of the stairs with the music playing in the background. I keep going to that Rocky analogy. I can't help myself, but I always think of a montage when we get into the redemption story. But I think we're about at the end of the event, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I would like to thank our speakers and panelists who have done such a wonderful job of covering the issues for us today. I'd like to thank you, our wonderful audience, for putting in such thoughtful questions that have helped us to explore this more. And to conclude, I'm really going to do a sales pitch. Can you please send the link to these resources to all of your colleagues and networks? Because what we really want is for our sector to be able to engage better with the media going forward. And that is not just about how the media engages with us, it's about how we engage with them. And we've done about a year's work of really intense work with our member organisations to develop this guide, and we hope that it's really useful for people going forward. But it can only be useful if they know about it. So please tell your friends and colleagues about it. And thank you for having us today.
And can we say thank you to James and the team who were on the working group, who have done an extraordinary job pulling it together. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a huge team effort. Have a good day.